Welcome, Adriano Mannino.
So, thanks to everyone who's involved in the organization of this great event here. Thanks for having me. I guess I should first say that I'm replacing Klaus Petrus, who should have been giving this talk here. Klaus Petrus from the organization TIF, Tier im Fokus. I am myself also a member of this organization, but I happen to be a member of other organizations too, such as the Swiss Vegan Society, VGS, and I'm also a member of the international organization Effective Animal Activism. Klaus would have addressed very specifically, and I guess in much detail, the issue of abolitionism versus reformism, and I guess that's still the title on the program that you've read. But for my talk, the title actually should be Abolitionism, Reformism, and Effective Animal Activism. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the details of the abolitionism versus reformism debate. I'm going to comment on it briefly, and I'm then going to elaborate on the concept of effective animal activism, which can be seen as a sort of meta-activism, providing very general tools for activists that can be applied across the board, even if strategic differences remain. So, just very roughly, I'm sure you're all familiar with that debate. Abolitionists could very briefly be characterized. Sorry, am I hiding the image? Could very briefly be characterized as people favoring the radical elimination of all exploitation and use of animals. Often they are also not that much into compromise and gradual tactics. On the other hand, reformists can briefly be characterized as people favoring gradual changes in the way we treat animals, that is, welfare reforms. Now, there is much hostility between these two broad camps, and I've tried to list here what I think are two conditions of serious debate and serious exchange between the camps. Namely, that serious reformists should acknowledge that they agree with the abolitionist aim and are defending a strategy to get there. I think that's pretty clear, unless one wants to stand on very shaky moral ground, because the arguments for anti-speciesism seem very clear, and of course they demand the ultimate abolition of animal exploitation. So that should be clear. And a second condition that I've listed regards the abolitionists. I think they should acknowledge that they cannot claim the moral high ground, as they often do, against the serious reformists, because the disagreement is strategic. It's not moral, it's strategic. They may be able to claim the strategic high ground, but that's an empirical dispute, and maybe should change the light in which they see the whole dispute. But against the serious reformists, I don't think the abolitionists could claim the moral high ground, as they often do. And I've also tried to list a few conditions of hostility, that might elicit or even justify hostile reactions, although I've put a question mark there because, if we primarily care about the consequences of what we do, then we also have to evaluate possible hostile reactions of our own in terms of whether they are likely to generate good consequences or not. And so it's always an open question and a pretty delicate issue. It seems that the default should be maybe not to be hostile if you want to persuade anyone. But it's commonly assumed that a belief that the strategically disagreeing group doesn't only fail to have maximum positive impact, but has even negative impact relative to the expected status quo, despite the best intentions, and this does actually hurting the cause. This seems to be what many take as the basic justification, maybe for hostile reactions. Now, claiming that others with the best intentions actually have a negative impact is a pretty strong claim. And it's also extraordinarily consequential, because it can lead to splits, splits always have costs, and so on. And if you're wrong on that point, then animals will suffer and die for a wrong decision that you've made. So extraordinarily consequential beliefs, as those are, should require extraordinary evidence. And we should maybe be careful before pronouncing such beliefs too loudly. As for the reformists, they often believe that abolitionists are ineffective. I guess it's not so frequent that reformists would say, well, abolitionists have clearly a negative impact. On the other hand, it's more the abolitionists who believe that the reformists actually have a negative impact and not maximally positive. So it seems that here the abolitionists are making a stronger claim. And do they also have strong evidence to support it? As I said, I cannot really enter into these empirically complex debates. But one point that's often made is that we've had animal protection, traditional animal protection, animal welfare for quite some time. And look at the situation, it's gotten worse. But Oscar has talked about biases. A related topic is logical fallacies. I mean, that's not a strictly valid argument because, I mean, after all, it could be that yes, we had welfare reforms, and yes, the situation is now worse overall, but still, it might not be causally due to the animal protection efforts. I mean, it might well be the case that the animal welfare, the traditional animal protection movement also, to some extent, prepared the ideological and societal ground on which the ideas of animal rights and veganism stand to some extent. I totally agree with Oscar that, of course, it would have been better to start out with anti-speciesism right away. But given that, given how deep our speciesist biases are, I mean, that would have been a very unlikely scenario, unfortunately. And that's probably why it started with animal welfare attempts. So I'm just saying those issues are incredibly complex. They involve incredibly complex history, sociology, psychology, and anyone should be cautious, I guess, to pronounce with certainty on them. Now I'm going to say something where Oscar might disagree with me. That's quite rare, actually, but it does happen. I believe it's probably quite hard to actually have a negative impact when raising concern for animals in our current situation. Even, I mean, I totally agree with Oscar that, we should be consistent, we should be trying and spread anti-speciesism as a consistent and philosophically sound view. But I'm not quite sure whether people who are, advancing inconsistent and maybe philosophically flawed views that even retain some speciesism, whether they're actually having a net negative impact. I think it's imaginable that they still have a positive impact, although they might be spreading some bullshit, simply because they raise the topic of animals, which then also gives more consistent voices the opportunity to speak up and so on. It's hard for me to take a stand on this issue, reformism versus abolitionism. And one problem is that I think many of the generalizations that reformists and abolitionists often make are just so context dependent and context sensitive. So you need to carefully look at the empirical context within which certain forms of activism take place, certain attempts at reform and so on. And I think you need to evaluate empirically and as scientifically and rigorously as possible the concrete situation. Another problem with reformism and abolitionism is that they are sort of what I call idea clusters. They are not single and precise ideas. They're more idea clusters, many ideas somehow linked together. And that often happens with belief systems, of course. I mean, take traditional religion or traditional political ideologies of any sort. I mean, it's like either you buy, often people either totally buy into one overall system or they don't. Or they totally buy into another system or they don't. So for instance, it's interesting if you know one person's stand on nuclear energy, for instance, you can almost deduce immediately what all the other positions will be that this person holds. And when you think about it, that's a pretty irrational setup. Oscar has talked about biases. Biases are irrational patterns. And if we are being rational, we should be able to examine all ideas in a piecemeal approach. We should analyze any idea cluster, take it apart, and then judge on the specifics and not on the overall idea cluster. So as for me, on some issues I tend to side with the abolitionists. On others I tend to side more with people who call themselves reformists. It's a very confused debate, it seems to me. So I think reformists might well be right when they say that abolitionists sometimes behave and communicate in evidently counterproductive ways. In this context, I can recommend the book by Nick Cooney, Change of Heart, a really good book putting together lots of findings from psychology, social psychology, attitude psychology, communication psychology. And I found it really useful. You know, when you're an activist, of course, you've got to talk to people all the time. How do you do that? What's most effective, and so on. Pretty good advice in that book. Reformists, I think, are wrong with their tendency to believe that more radical demands and alternative visions are somehow necessarily almost ineffective. Again, I totally agree with Oscar. It's important that we stress and spread anti-speciesism, and that's, of course, a pretty radical view to spread, given our status quo. But still, I think it's likely the most effective thing to do. And reformists here might have some sort of moderation bias when it comes to this question. But still, when you're rational, you should always try to see with fresh eyes. Come to a question and try to shake off any ideological baggage that you might have. That's very, very difficult. Of course, we're all running on human and thus mistaken and flawed brains, but still we should make an attempt. And seeing with fresh eyes, I'd like to ask the following questions. What could both abolitionists and reformists do to increase their effectiveness? Are there such things? What conditions do both the abolitionist and the reformist strategy depend on? And how can we evaluate the cost effectiveness of different forms of activism more undogmatically and scientifically without a prior commitment to either abolitionism or reformism? And I've tried to list 2 points here, which I think might be thought of as preconditions to desirable long-term change. I think whatever you believe is the most effective thing to spread, of course you want to reach as many, as influential hearts and minds as quickly as possible. That's always something you want to do if you want to be effective. And also I think a point we should be able to agree on is that we should try and develop and further the vegan alternative. And I also think both points might be quite strongly interrelated, because a big barrier, and that's also evidenced by many psychological findings, a big barrier to accepting anti-speciesism and overcoming all the biases against it seems to be simply that we are, as a matter of fact, consuming animals. And that's why we are all the more prone to self-serving biases that might lead us to believe, you know, that maybe it's not wrong after all, and so on, and to reject these arguments that we would maybe otherwise accept. And so it seems to me to be very clear that the presence and great visibility of a vegan alternative furthers the spread of the values that we deem important. But maybe it's more than psychology. Maybe it's also a genuinely ethical argument could be made here. Because I think it could be argued that the strength of a duty that we might have is, among other things, a function of the necessity or the alternatives that are available. So I think the ethical duty not to consume animals is, of course, much stronger if it's extremely easy for you to eat vegan. And it's probably less strong if it's harder for you due to adverse circumstances to eat vegan. And so there might, apart from psychology, there might also be a genuinely moral point here. Now, as I said, we want many people, we want influential people, and we want to reach them quickly. And this is where the mentioned organization, Effective Animal Activism, comes in. In fact, the idea was copied from the sector of human charity or human-related world improvement. For human charity, there's the analogous organization givingwhatwecan.org. There are other organizations in this field, and they try to bring the best tools that we have to the question of what sorts of activism, what sorts of projects do actually have the biggest demonstrable impact. And effective animal activism is trying to do precisely that for animal charities, for projects related to non-human animals. That's a screenshot from the website of Effective Animal Activism. So they evaluate charities, their programs, they try to collect data. They, of course, I mean, one important beginning step is transparency. If a charity is not transparent, then it can hardly be evaluated. So they're doing that sort of thing. And then they come up with certain charity recommendations. And just to give you an example of why this might be very important in ethical terms, and Oscar has already touched on the argument. I mean, if we are not being cost effective, then that means some animals are suffering and dying that we could have saved with a better method. So much is at stake. And just in order to illustrate it, let's take two hypothetical projects. Of course, you find many real-life examples for them. In order to see the massive differences in cost effectiveness that exists among organizations and projects. So suppose project A is as follows. Set up a shelter and enable people to free or adopt an animal for, say, $5,000 a year. And so we might spend about $50,000 on one animal overall by going for this sort of project. Project B could be to reach 10,000 people with a strong vegan message per $1,000 invested. So we would reach 500,000 people with $50,000. Now, suppose, very conservatively, that only a few of these people that we reach go vegan or at least vegetarian as a consequence. Then that would probably, the effect of that alone would outweigh the effect of Project A by many orders of magnitude, given that an average meat eater consumes about 1,000 to 3,000 animals per lifetime. Of course, I mean, that's just a sketchy number, and there are market mechanisms, price elasticity, subsidies, and so on, that make the calculations messy, but it still gives you a rough idea. And so, I'm not saying that we should give up on projects of the A type or whatever. I am myself a member and supporter of organizations that run such projects, and of course, I mean, it's good for the single animal that we save, and it might also be of very significant societal symbolic value, just showing that, we can free adopt an animal, we can live with the animal without ever exploiting it in any way. So that's certainly also an important signal. But still, I mean, if we have limited resources and if we are making new decisions, for instance, if we have a limited budget of $50,000, then I think it's extremely important from an ethical point of view that we take such considerations very seriously indeed. Now you might ask, okay, if we go for B, the claim here is that we can reach 10,000 people with 1,000 invested. Now, how could we do that? I've listed a few projects here that we could be pursuing. So one thing that effective animal activism recommends is college leafleting. So leafleting, I mean, a pretty common activity, but specifically targeting colleges might be a little less common, but it seems actually to be very important. I mean, again, if we try to rely on the science that's available and also on common sense, they are not in contradiction here, it's clear that we are more likely to change younger people's minds than older people's minds. That's just a psychological fact about humans. Also, if we go for colleges, we might be more likely to target educated people, maybe with pre-existing interests in related subjects, so on. Last but not least, by targeting young people, we are targeting the people that are going to shape the future and that still have the most years ahead of them. So there are a number of arguments for specifically targeting this group. Another form of activism that might be very effective is spreading in social media. I mean, yeah, that might sound a bit boring, you know, activism at home in front of the computer. But again, we might have a bit of a bias against it because, you know, we believe, and that belief might be justified to some extent, that we also got to go out, build a movement, a protest in the streets and so on. That belief certainly has a certain justification. But it's amazing what we can do if we use modern technology, modern communication technology, social media in the most effective way possible. So for instance, there are a bunch of people in Switzerland, in Basel to be precise, where I live, who are trying to do grassroots vegan animal rights activism according to the principles of effective animal activism. And what we have done is we have simply tried to find the largest Facebook groups involving students, different subjects, universities, and that gave us an overall reach of up to 1 million people. Now we can write blog posts or shoot videos or get footage from animal farms and so on and spread all the material in there. And it's just pretty much amazing what a single person can do just by spending a few hours in front of the computer, boring activity, but the number of people you can reach is just crazy. It's just crazy if you do it the right way, you do it the efficient way. And thanks. It's something you'd never be able to achieve in the real world. It's something that can only be done in the digital world. Then I listed political activism that generates a lot of media attention. I'll come back to that later. And last but not least, that's the current top recommendation by effective animal activism, and it sort of combines the leafleting idea with the digital, the online idea. So there is a way to hand out leaflets online, actually, and it can be done via online ads on Google, on Facebook. And so you can have a vegan ad or whatever, and the great thing is that you can target it again. So you are only paying for click. You're paying each time a person clicks on the ad, and the ad can be targeted again to young people, to people with related interests, and so on. And people that click on the ad are then directed to a landing page. And you can put on the landing page whatever you think is most effective. Some videos, so for instance, one landing page is Who's Against Animal Cruelty? It shows the very popular Farm to Fridge video, which you might have seen. And the good thing is also that you can monitor the effectiveness of your activism, of your message, if you do it online. For instance, you can compare the click rates between different ads, or you can compare the time that people stay on the landing page watching the video, or you can compare the feedback rate that you get, and so on and so forth. And then you can optimize what you are doing. And again, the reach seems pretty crazy. And effective animal activism, and that's the main reason why they come up with this currently as their top suggestion, they have a challenge. They say, well, how can we reach more and more promising people per hour invested than by, say, earning $30, say, and then buying 300 targeted online ads, if that's 10 cents per click. So, you know, it might be a little unusual form of activism to earn a lot and then try to donate towards these ads. But if you really want to reach the greatest possible number of people, then that seems like a good bet. So an example would be, suppose you donate $1,000 each month. That might sound like a lot, but if you earn an average Western income, it's actually not a lot at all. I mean, if you give 1,000 away, then you're probably still among the very richest people on the planet and that have ever lived throughout history. So I know many people who are doing that currently, giving about $1,000 away per month, and that means they are reaching 10,000 people a month or 120,000 people a year. And those are crazy figures, and there's no way you could possibly achieve that by handing out leaflets. That's also a good thing about leafleting online. The human time cost is very, very small. We're also trying to put this into practice here in Switzerland. Online ads for Switzerland, and the landing page will be tiere-essen.ch. If you're interested in projects like these, be sure to add me on Facebook. If you're not interested, add me anyway. Yeah. Another crucial point that effective animal activism is analyzing is career choice. Maybe I could ask you a preliminary question. How many of you would consider yourselves full-time activists, professional activists, animal rights activists? How many? Raise your hands, please. Okay. How many of you would like to be full-time animal rights activists, but are not? Quite a number of hands, yeah. That's what I expected, actually, and hope I'll be able to make my point with reference to this great sociological study here. So we are all direct benefiters. That's a term used by effective animal activism. We are directly benefiting non-human animals, or if we analyze it morally, we are stopping the harm that we're doing them, but it means, in terms of the sort of future world that we're bringing about, it means a benefit to non-human animals. But of course we want to do much more. That's why we are activists. We want to be direct activists also. We want to persuade others to make the same choices. And if we are able to persuade just 2 people, that will double the impact that we can ever have with our consumption alone. If we are able to persuade 10 people, then that has tenfold the impact. And again, if we are pursuing the most effective ways of reaching people, we might be able to persuade many, many more people. Now, can we do better than that? What about the idea, again, maybe a very strange, certainly new idea, of becoming a professional donor? What if you could fund several activists? What if you had the option of becoming an activist yourself, or earning a sufficient amount of money to pay for several activists? That could, again, multiply your impact. The fact is that many animal rights organizations and many charities in general are heavily underfunded and cannot hire the many dedicated people that would be willing to work for them full time, even for free. But of course, everyone needs to have a basic income on which to live, and unfortunately, we don't have this very nice idea yet, although there's currently a popular initiative in Switzerland, as you might know, demanding its introduction. So the idea would be, well, what about this? Don't be an activist, be a meta-activist. Try and pay for several activists. I mean, if that's your thing, if that's an option that you have, might be worthwhile to consider this option. And indeed, a growing number of people, internationally as well as in Switzerland, are pursuing this professional donor career and have pledged to donate half of what they earn, or everything above a threshold of $25,000, say. And when you think about it, if you have the option of earning, say, having a job that pays quite well, say $100,000 a year, and if you say, I'm really committed to that cause, and I recognize, that just material wealth isn't going to make me happy. What's going to make me much happier is the knowledge that I'm having a positive impact, that I'm making a positive difference to so many non-human animals. Then you might say, yeah, I'm fine with living on $25,000 a year. Now, many people who are doing this, and with giving away $75,000, say. Seems like a crazy idea, but if you think about it, why is it actually? And with those $75,000, you could fund maybe 3 people who would be doing full-time activism. And that seems like a very great thing, given that there are so many organizations that would be interested in hiring people, and so many people that would be interested in doing this full-time, this very meaningful, high-impact activity, but we just lack the money. So the idea would be, when we still lack politically this institution of a guaranteed basic income, which would be very nice to have, of course, the idea is that some of the activists, it might be a very strategic thing to do for some of the activists, not to become direct activists, but to earn the money to then fund others. Maybe you can go up higher still in the impact tree. Now we've gone up to the professional donor, but what if you're successful? What if you say, well, no, I'm not the type for high earning and stuff, really can't do this, really got to go on working directly with people or whatever. Maybe you might be able to persuade lots of others to donate to lots of other full-time activists who are then going to persuade people. Returning now to the subject of political activism with huge media attention, I think political activism is a double-edged sword. I mean, it's pretty risky. It's certainly much riskier than, say, leafleting or online ads, because success chances are often quite low. Still, if you succeed politically with a good measure, you might have a pretty high leverage and the impact might be high. At the current time, though, I believe that education, value spreading, idea spreading, spreading and explaining of arguments, as Oscar said with regard to anti-speciesism, might be the most important thing, because we're still at the point where there's just not a sufficient number of people within society caring about animals in the right and consistent way. And so I believe success chances for concrete political steps that would really make a difference and move us forward are pretty low. Still, political activism might recommend itself if it is a means by which you can reach many people. And that might well be the case. So for instance, that's a personal example. I was involved in the Initiative for a Vegetarian and Vegan University Canteen in Basel. And that initiative generated nationwide media attention over the duration of several weeks. And that probably had a pretty large impact, in getting people to think about the issue, to Google veganism or animal rights and so on. And so I tentatively believe that this was a very high impact thing. But again, I mean, such opportunities don't come on a regular basis. You can be on the lookout for them and seize them when they arise. Then I'd like to propose another idea. Leaving university parliaments and going to a real national parliament and population. What about launching, for instance, a national initiative by the animal rights movement? That would mean we'd have to collect 100,000 signatures in 18 months, and we would get a week-long national debate and vote for sure. The human power needed is actually quite limited, and I believe we could easily do it at this point already. So you need about 200 people, dedicated people, collecting 500 signatures over these 18 months. And that's actually very easy to do. I've been involved in several such initiatives, and it's really no problem. You can also, usually you find more than 200 people who are willing to contribute. And so we could do it. Again, what might be a problem is funding. You need about 100,000 Swiss francs to be safely able to get the thing off the ground. Still, that money probably is lacking. But when you think about it, 100,000, that's really not too much. I mean, couldn't we convince fairly quickly people of the idea of effective donation, maybe even convincing people of young people becoming professional donors and so on, and then that money would be probably there in no time. Of course, a crucial question would be, well, what should be the content of such an initiative? What should be the demand? Should it be rather reformist, or rather abolitionist, or might that be the wrong questions? I mean, if we recall what I think might be preconditions to desirable long-term change. So one point was we want to reach as many as influential hearts and minds as quickly as possible. Might be something we can achieve with that project. And we also want to develop the vegan alternative. So why not go for a demand that would say, that's just very tentative, I'm just thinking aloud here, and I'd be very keen on hearing your responses to your thoughts on this idea. What about going for a demand that would maybe say something like, we demand a state furtherance of vegan agriculture, for instance. I mean, there would be many ways to argue for this, based on things that people already accept. That's always good. That's also, I mentioned the book by Nick Cooney. One of the best psychological strategies that you can do is first be on the lookout for people's interests, for what they already believe, and argue in these terms. I mean, one line of argument we could pursue is that that's actually no more stringent a demand than what's already in place with regard to so-called lab animals, for instance. There we have the 3R principle, reduce, refine, replace. Of course, one can criticize it on many grounds, but one thing that it holds is that it's illegal to use animals in research if an alternative is available. Then you must replace it. And if we apply that simple logic, for instance, to food, veganism seems to follow immediately. Yeah? We are not allowed to hurt, use, exploit any animals for the purpose if there is an alternative. And in the case of food, it's uncontroversially available, so that's one line of reasoning we could pursue. I don't know whether Oscar might object that, is it anti-speciesist enough? Veganism is certainly in there, but to me that's not much of a concern, because within the national and public debate that would result, we would certainly have ample opportunity to talk about anti-speciesism, to link people to nice websites, to organize panel discussions, and so on. And let me stress one more time the point that I already alluded to. I think the presence and visibility of easy alternatives affect, and I also believe I could cite some nice psychological studies on this, affect persuasion. So the biases that Oscar talked about are really pervasive, but as I said, one main reason why they are so effective is because people realize, hey, if I'm going to accept these arguments, and these arguments are sound, and of course in my right mind I would accept them, then I'm going to have to change my behavior. And behavior change is so difficult, and we have loss aversion and all sorts of cognitive biases that prevent us from just doing the easy step. I mean, that's a very common experience. You do the step and then it's much easier than you thought before. And that's why I think developing this alternative, making it visible, might also help the cause of reaching many hearts and minds as quickly as possible with the right values. I have a quote by Leonard Nelson, one of the first animal rights advocates and philosopher. He said, the treatment this problem, that is, the problem of the moral status of non-human animals, has received in ethics would be a devastating testimony to the quality of human reason, were it not apparent from the very beginning that the issue is not so much intellectual error, but self-interest. And, maybe that's also somewhat encouraging, because, the arguments for anti-speciesism are so clear. You ask yourself, how could people be, we knew that people are stupid, of course, we ourselves are stupid, but how can people be so stupid? And the answer is, well, they probably aren't. At some level, they know that they are wrong, and that the arguments are pretty clear, but still, you'd have to change your behavior, and this or that would follow, and what about wild animals, for instance, tricky issues, and then you stay put. But if we succeed in pushing the vegan alternative, making it visible, making people feel that it's easy and easily practicable, then that might also take away some of the force of these cognitive biases. And with that, I'd like to end. So if there's any take-home message to this talk, I think we should really be concerned at this point with the question of how we can reach as many, as influential hearts and minds as quickly as possible. We should try to be rational and scientific about this question, try to use the best communication technology available, and we should try and push the vegan alternative. Maybe a way of combining these 2 points would be to go in the middle term for this national initiative that I'm suggesting, maybe with the content of state furtherance of vegan agriculture. And as I said, I'd be very glad to hear your thoughts on this tentative proposal. And thanks a lot for your attention.